What happens when the God you've learned to trust asks for the very thing he promised you? That moment when your greatest blessing becomes the test of your deepest faith? Today, we're walking through one of the most emotionally challenging stories in all of Scripture, where Abraham faces a request that seems to contradict everything he knows about God's character. And if you're already feeling that tension in your chest, good. This is one of those stories you're not supposed to rush through. So let's slow it down and sit in it together. Picture this. You've waited decades for a promise to be fulfilled. You've seen God work miracles, provide impossibly, and prove his faithfulness again and again. Finally, that long-awaited promise arrives. Your son is born, your legacy is secured, your faith has been vindicated. And then God speaks again, asking for something that makes absolutely no sense. This is exactly where we find Abraham in Genesis 22. Isaac, the child of promise, is no longer a baby. He's grown into a young man, probably in his 20s. Abraham has watched him develop, knowing that through this son, God's promise of descendants, as numerous as the stars, would be fulfilled. Isaac represents everything Abraham had hoped for, everything God had promised, everything that made sense about their covenant together. But then comes a test that would challenge every assumption Abraham had about God's plans. This is one of those verses where you read it twice just to make sure you didn't misunderstand it. The instruction is stark and shocking.
Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.
Let's pause here because this moment deserves our full attention. This isn't about God demanding child sacrifice. That was never his heart or his plan. Let's be very clear that because context matters. God is not being cruel. God is being intentional. This is about something much deeper. This is about the difference between loving God's gifts and loving God himself. This is about whether Abraham's faith was ultimately in God's promises or in God's character. Think about what this request must have done to Abraham's mind. For decades, his entire understanding of God's plan centered around Isaac. This was the son through whom nations would come. This was the fulfillment of divine promise. This was the miracle child born to Sarah when she was 90 years old. How could God ask for Isaac's life when Isaac was essential to God's own promises? And this is the space where faith either collapses or deepens. What Abraham does next tells us everything about how far his faith has grown. He doesn't argue. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't remind God of previous promises or point out the logical inconsistency. Instead, he rises early the next morning, saddles his donkey, cuts wood for the burnt offering, and heads toward the mountain with Isaac and 2 servants. This isn't the response of someone acting on impulse or emotion. This is the response of someone whose faith has matured through decades of walking with God. Early faith asks whether God will do what he promises. Mature faith trusts God even when his requests seem to contradict his promises. The journey to Mount Moriah takes 3 days. Can you imagine what those 3 days must have been like for Abraham? 3 days is a long time to walk with a decision you can't undo. No distractions, no fast forward button. Every step forward was a step toward doing something that made no sense, yet he kept walking. Every conversation with Isaac was layered with knowledge the young man didn't possess. Every night around the campfire was heavy with unspoken weight. And this is the line that changes the entire atmosphere of the story. Then comes the moment that breaks my heart every time I read it. Isaac, carrying the wood for his own sacrifice, asks the question that must have pierced Abraham's soul.
Father, where is the lamb for the burnt offering?
Here's this trusting son, walking alongside his father, helping with preparations, and asking the most innocent yet devastating question imaginable. Abraham's answer reveals everything about where his faith has landed.
God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.
Notice he doesn't say God has provided. He says God will provide. This is trust spoken out loud when silence would have been easier. This is trust declared while still walking toward the impossible. They reach the mountain. Abraham builds the altar. He arranges the wood. He binds Isaac. Think about this moment. Isaac is a grown man. He could have resisted, could have run, could have fought back, but he trusts his father completely. He allows himself to be bound and placed on the altar. This is a picture of willing surrender, of trust that goes beyond understanding. Abraham raises the knife. This is the point of no return. Obedience has gone all the way. In this moment, he's prepared to give back to God the very gift that God had given him. He's chosen to trust God's character over his own understanding of God's promises. He's decided that his relationship with God matters more than his attachment to God's gifts. And that's when God intervenes.
Abraham, Abraham,
The angel of the Lord calls from heaven,
do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.
Abraham names that place
The Lord will provide.
in Hebrew. It's Jehovah Jireh, not the Lord has provided, but the Lord will provide. It's a declaration of ongoing trust, a statement that God's provision isn't just for this moment, but for every moment yet to come. This entire experience transforms Abraham's understanding of who God is. He learns that God is not just the giver of good gifts, but the source of all good things. He discovers that surrender doesn't destroy God's promises, but often becomes the pathway to their fulfillment. He realizes that God never asks for something without having already provided what's needed. And then Scripture does what real life does. It moves forward, even when we're still processing. But this story doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a larger narrative about a family learning to trust God through every season of life. After this mountaintop experience, Abraham faces another kind of loss that tests his faith in a completely different way. In Genesis 23, Sarah dies, the woman who laughed when God promised her a son, who waited 90 years to become a mother, who journeyed with Abraham through decades of faith-building adventures, is gone. Abraham grieves openly and deeply. He weeps for her, mourns her loss, and seeks to bury her with honor. This moment teaches us something crucial about faith. Trust in God doesn't eliminate human sorrow. Following God's will doesn't mean we won't experience heartbreak. Abraham's faith was real and mature, but he still mourned his wife's death. Spiritual maturity doesn't require us to pretend that loss doesn't hurt. Faith doesn't numb pain. It gives us a place to bring it. Abraham negotiates with the Hittites to purchase a burial cave for Sarah. He refuses their offer to give him the land for free, instead insisting on paying full price. Even in grief, he's thinking about the future, establishing a permanent foothold in the promised land. Even in grief, God is still writing the story. This burial site becomes the first piece of Canaan that Abraham legally owns, a down payment on God's promise that his descendants will inherit this territory. With Sarah gone, Abraham turns his attention to securing the next generation. Isaac is now the sole carrier of God's promise, and he needs a wife who will partner with him in God's purposes. But Abraham doesn't want Isaac to marry just anyone. He wants a wife who comes from his own family line, someone who shares their understanding of who God is. So Abraham sends his most trusted servant back to Mesopotamia with specific instructions. Find a wife for Isaac among our relatives. Don't take Isaac back to the old country, but bring the woman here to the land of promise. The servant goes, not knowing exactly how he'll identify the right woman, but trusting that the same God who provided a ram for Abraham will provide direction for this mission. This next part isn't loud, but it's deeply intentional. What happens next is a beautiful example of how God works through ordinary faithfulness to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. Sometimes the miracle isn't flashy, it's just right. The servant arrives in the city of Nahor and stops at a well during the evening when women come to draw water. He prays a specific prayer, asking God to show him Isaac's future wife through an act of kindness that goes beyond normal courtesy. Almost immediately, Rebekah appears. She's beautiful, but more importantly, she's kind and generous. When the servant asks for a drink, she not only gives him water, but offers to water his camels as well. This is no small gesture. Camels can drink up to 25 gallons of water after a long journey. Watering 10 camels would have required dozens of trips to the well, significant physical labor that no one would expect from a stranger. but Rebekah does it cheerfully, going far beyond what was requested. She demonstrates the same kind of generous spirit that characterizes Abraham's family. When the servant explains his mission and God's clear answer to his prayer, Rebekah's family recognizes divine providence at work. They agree to the marriage, and Rebekah herself chooses to leave immediately rather than wait months for a more convenient departure. Isaac is out in the field meditating when he sees the caravan approaching. Rebekah sees him and covers herself with her veil, following the customs of the time. When they meet, it's love at first sight. The scripture says that Isaac loved her and was comforted after his mother's death. God has provided not just a wife for Isaac, but exactly the right partner for the next chapter of his promise. God doesn't just replace what's lost, he restores what's needed. Genesis 25 brings us to the end of Abraham's earthly journey. He lives to be 175 years old, which the scripture describes as dying in a good old age, an old man and full of years. He's lived to see his son married, his promise continuing, his faith vindicated. He dies satisfied, having witnessed God's faithfulness through decades of ups and downs. So what's particularly touching about Abraham's death is who comes to bury him. Both Isaac and Ishmael, despite the family complications and years of separation, come together to honor their father. If you know this family's history, you know how meaningful that moment is. They bury him in the same cave where Sarah is buried, reuniting them in death as they were partners in life. God's faithfulness extends to both sons, blessing Isaac as the heir of promise, while also keeping his word to make Ishmael into a great nation. The covenant continues through Isaac, but God doesn't abandon Ishmael. Both sons experience God's provision and blessing, just in different ways. This reminds us that God's promises often have broader implications than we initially understand. His faithfulness extends further than our limited perspective can see. Let's bring this home for a second. What does this entire sequence teach us about trust and surrender? First, it shows us that mature faith isn't about perfect understanding, but about perfect relationship. Abraham didn't understand why God would ask for Isaac, but he trusted God's character enough to obey even when it didn't make sense. Second, it demonstrates that God's requests are never about destruction, but about liberation. When God asks us to surrender something precious, it's not because he wants to take it away, but because he wants to free us from unhealthy attachment. Abraham had to learn that his faith was in God himself, not in God's gifts. Third, it reveals that God always provides what he requires. He asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but he provided the ram. He required a wife for Isaac, but he arranged the perfect encounter with Rebekah. He demanded trust in impossible circumstances, but he proved worthy of that trust every single time. Fourth, it teaches us that surrender doesn't destroy God's promises, but often becomes the pathway to their fulfillment. Abraham's willingness to give up Isaac actually secured Isaac's future in ways that holding on tightly never could have accomplished. Finally, it shows us that faith and grief can coexist beautifully. Abraham trusted God completely, but he still mourned Sarah's death deeply. Spiritual maturity doesn't mean we stop feeling human emotions. It means we process those emotions within the context of God's larger purposes. Maybe you're in a season where God is asking you to surrender something precious. Maybe it's a relationship, a dream, a plan, or a position that feels essential to your happiness. Abraham's story reminds us that what God asks us to release, he's capable of redeeming. What he requires us to surrender, he's able to restore in ways that exceed our original hopes. Or perhaps you're walking through a season of loss, like Abraham experienced with Sarah's death. His example shows us that we can grieve honestly while still trusting God's faithfulness. We can mourn what we've lost while still believing that God's purposes continue even through our pain. The beautiful truth that runs through this entire narrative is that God's faithfulness doesn't depend on our perfect understanding. His love doesn't waver when we don't immediately comprehend his ways. His promises don't fail when we can't see how they'll be fulfilled. Take some time this week to examine what you might be holding too tightly. Ask yourself whether your faith is ultimately in God's gifts or in God himself. Consider where he might be asking you to trust his character over your own understanding of his promises. Remember that every request for surrender is actually an invitation to deeper freedom. Every call to trust is an opportunity to experience his faithfulness in new ways. If you're walking through a season of loss or confusion, if you're struggling to understand how God's promises fit with your current circumstances, take courage from Abraham's example. Keep walking by faith, even when you can't see the destination clearly. Keep trusting God's character, even when his requests don't make immediate sense. Keep believing that the same God who provided a ram in the thicket and brought Rebekah to the well is still providing exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. Next time, we'll explore how this pattern of faith continues into the next generation as we look at Isaac and Jacob's story. But for now, rest in this truth. You serve a God who sees your situation, knows your heart, and loves you more than you can imagine. Whatever he's asking you to trust him with today, he's worthy of that trust. His faithfulness has never failed, and it never will. And if trusting him feels hard right now, you're not failing. You're learning. Wherever you are, and whatever you're walking through, I want you to know that God sees you, he knows your heart, and he loves you more than you can imagine. You're never out of his reach, and you're never out of his care. If this time together encouraged you, feel free to like and subscribe so you can join me again. I'll see you next time.